My parents leaned back in their chairs and chuckled with a patronizing warmth that felt like a slap to my face, looking me straight in the eyes before stating that I would never be as successful or as talented as my older sister. I am Jocelyn, a 29-year-old data analyst who has spent my entire adult life being the invisible safety net for this family while everyone else focused on the shining star of the household. I stood up slowly, the silence in the room heavy with their expectations, and told my father to ask his golden daughter to pay every single bill from now on, because I was officially done sending my hard-earned money to this house. The laughter died instantly as my mother stared at me with a look of genuine confusion, her voice trembling when she asked what money I was talking about, since they supposedly had never received a single dollar from my account. I felt the weight of 4 years of hidden sacrifices pressing against my chest while I watched them rewrite my entire history of support right there at the dinner table. They were so convinced of their own lies that they actually believed my sister was the one keeping the lights on and the taxes paid, while I was just the quiet, ungrateful observer in the corner. If they wanted to believe the fantasy they had built around her perfection, then they could finally deal with the cold reality of the empty bank account I was leaving behind. Before we dive deeper into the chaos that followed that night, I would love to know what time it is and which city you are watching from right now, so I can see just how far my story has traveled across the world. Don't forget to drop a comment below because your support truly helps me share these raw experiences with all of you. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on this journey. Growing up in Austin meant living in a house where the air was always thick with the scent of Valerie's expensive perfumes and the constant noise of her supposed achievements. I remember countless evenings sitting at the kitchen table doing my homework in the dark because my parents were too busy filming Valerie for her latest social media pageant. Mom would often walk past me without a word to adjust the lighting for Valerie, as if I were just a piece of furniture that happened to occupy space in their perfect gallery. Gregory and Beverly spent every spare cent on her private lessons while I wore hand-me-downs and worked at the local library just to buy my own school supplies. They never noticed that I was consistently at the top of my class in mathematics because they were too busy telling the neighbors how Valerie was destined for greatness. I learned very early on that my role in this family was to be the silent foundation, the one who kept things running while the star was allowed to flicker whenever she pleased. I spent my weekends writing Valerie's essays and fixing her chaotic schedules, just so my parents wouldn't have to deal with her inevitable meltdowns. They looked at her and saw a bright future, but when they looked at me, they only saw a reliable tool that didn't require much maintenance. It wasn't just the lack of praise that hurt. It was the way they made me feel like my quiet stability was a boring defect compared to her loud instability. I vividly recall one evening when I tried to show my father my college acceptance letter with a full scholarship only for him to brush it aside because Valerie had just gained 1,000 new followers online. He told me that being smart was fine, but Valerie had the charisma that actually moved the world, and I should try to learn from her instead of being so dry and analytical. That was the moment I realized that no matter how much I achieved, I would always be the background music to her off-key solo performance. I started keeping my victories to myself, building a secret world of ambition that they couldn't touch or diminish with their indifference. I watched as Valerie drifted from one failed project to another, always supported by my parents' unwavering belief, while I quietly saved every penny from my library shifts. The unfairness was a slow daily erosion of my self-worth that forced me to become stronger and more independent than they ever expected. I became a master of observation, seeing the cracks in Valerie's facade long before anyone else did. Yet I stayed silent because I knew my words held no value. I was the one who remembered to change the air filters and check the tire pressure, while Valerie was praised for simply showing up to dinner on time. Even back then, the hierarchy was set in stone with Valerie at the peak, and me somewhere in the shadows. My parents didn't realize they were raising one daughter to fly, and the other to be the landing strip, never considering what would happen if the landing strip decided to move. The resentment simmered under the surface of my skin for years, fueled by every "why can't you be more like her" comment. I realized that to them, my only value was my ability to facilitate her life without ever asking for a life of my own. 7 years ago, I packed the remnants of my teenage dreams into a rusted sedan and drove 13 hours away to Atlanta without a single person in that house, noticing I was gone until the next morning. I started my new life in a studio apartment, working 2 different entry-level jobs while studying for my advanced certifications at night. It was during those grueling months that I met my best friend Caleb, who was working as a junior loan officer at a local credit union. Caleb was the first person to actually look at my spreadsheets and tell me that my mind for numbers was a weapon that could build a fortress. He watched me struggle through the exhaustion, often bringing me coffee during my late-night study sessions when I felt like giving up on everything. While my parents were busy sending Valerie to expensive retreats, I was learning how to analyze market trends and predict financial risks with surgical precision. Caleb reminded me that my value wasn't determined by how much light Valerie stole from the room, but by the quiet power I was building. He was there when I got my first real promotion at a tech firm, celebrating on the floor of my empty apartment because I couldn't afford furniture yet. I remember my father calling me for the first time in months, only to ask if I knew how to fix a bug on Valerie's new laptop. I didn't tell him I was managing a team of 5 analysts, or that I had just secured a salary that would have made him jealous. I simply said I was busy and hung up, feeling a strange mix of triumph as I realized they still saw me as a free technician. Caleb warned me that as I became more successful, they would eventually find a way to tap into my resources. He taught me how to set up diversified portfolios, ensuring that my wealth would be protected from the emotional blackmail he knew was coming. I spent my early 20s building a wall of financial security that no one in Austin could see, working 60-hour weeks until the numbers became a comfort. I watched from afar as Valerie continued her cycle of failures, always bailed out by my parents' shrinking retirement fund. I knew the moment was coming when their pride would finally collide with their bank balance, and I prepared for the role I was destined to play. Caleb stayed by my side, never letting me forget that I was the architect of my own life, while Valerie was just a tenant in my parents' delusions. I finally reached a point where I didn't need their approval to feel whole yet. I still felt a lingering sense of duty to the people who raised me. It was this lingering thread of loyalty that eventually led me to open my checkbook for them, a decision that I would come to regret. Caleb saw the hesitation in my eyes but respected my choice, knowing that I had to see the truth for myself before I could walk away. 5 years have passed since I made the silent commitment to become the secret benefactor of a family that refused to acknowledge my existence. It started with a frantic call from Beverly, who was crying because the city was threatening to put a lien on their house due to unpaid property taxes. I sat in my high-rise office and realized that Gregory had likely spent their tax money on Valerie's failed boutique venture. Without a second thought, I transferred $15,000 directly to the county treasurer and told my mother that the problem was solved. I watched as the months turned into years, and my secret contributions grew to paying off their credit card debts and covering medical insurance premiums. I set up a system of automated bill payments, ensuring that every major expense was taken care of before they even knew the bills had arrived. Every time Gregory bragged about how Valerie was helping out with expenses, I felt a cold knot of bitterness tighten in my stomach. Valerie would post photos of herself taking our parents to dinner, knowing full well she was using the money I had sent for Mom's physical therapy. I was funding a lifestyle for Valerie that allowed her to look like a hero, while I continued to be treated like the family disappointment. I saw the statements every month, watching my hard-earned bonuses vanish into the pit of Valerie's vanity. Caleb often looked at my bank records and shook his head, asking me Tai Sao. I continued to subsidize a lie that was actively hurting me. I told him I was doing it for mom and dad, but deep down I was waiting for a moment where they would finally see the truth. I was paying for the hope of a reconciliation that was never going to happen, buying my way into a family dynamic that was rigged against me. Gregory once told me that it was a shame I wasn't more like Valerie, who was so generous with her resources, even though she was a busy artist. I almost choked as I realized Valerie had been taking credit for every single large payment I had made toward their mortgage. She had convinced them that she was the one sacrificing her career, while I was just the stingy one who never even brought a nice gift. The level of deception was breathtaking, but what was even more shocking was how easily my parents believed her over the daughter who actually had a job. I kept a meticulous digital folder of every transaction, treating it like a murder investigation that I hoped I would never have to close. I was trapped in a cycle of providing for people who used my money to fuel their disrespect toward me. I watched as Valerie's social media grew more elaborate, filled with vacations that were all indirectly paid for by my refusal to let my parents suffer. I was the silent engine of their survival, yet they treated me like a spare tire they hoped they would never have to use. Every dollar I sent was a brick in a wall of resentment that was growing taller with every passing month. I knew that the truth would eventually come out, but I didn't realize it would happen in such a public and humiliating way for all of us. 3 months before the retirement party, I received a notification that a new line of credit had been opened in my parents' names with a balance of $20,000. I investigated the charges and discovered that Valerie had used Gregory's social security number to fund a luxury trip to the Amalfi Coast for herself and our parents. I sat in my living room and realized that she had reached a point of no return with her greed. When I called Mom, she spent 40 minutes praising Valerie's incredible heart and how she had worked overtime to afford such a magnificent gesture. She even had the audacity to suggest that I should feel bad for not contributing anything to the family's happiness during such a milestone year. I listened to the pride in her voice and felt a wave of nausea as I realized my parents were blind to the fact that their credit score was being decimated. Valerie had successfully convinced them that her lack of a steady income was just a sign of her being a high-level entrepreneur who made lump sum payments. I realized then that my silence was no longer protecting them, it was enabling their destruction at the hands of their favorite child. I began to prepare for the retirement party not with a gift, but with a folder of facts that would serve as my final testimony. I watched Valerie post a countdown to the event, calling it a celebration of family loyalty and the success we built together. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating, and I found myself practicing my response in the mirror for weeks. I knew that the moment I spoke up, the fragile peace we had maintained for years would be shattered beyond repair. Caleb offered to come with me as a witness, knowing that my parents would try to gaslight me into believing I was the one who was mistaken. I felt a strange sense of calm as the date approached, a feeling of clarity that only comes when you decide to stop participating in a theater of lies. I watched as Valerie spent the week before the party shopping for a custom gown, likely using the money I had sent for Gregory's medication. She was so confident in her deception that she didn't even think I would dare to challenge her in front of their friends. My parents spent the days leading up to the event bragging to everyone about how their eldest daughter was the backbone of the family. They were setting the stage for their own humiliation, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to save them. I was done being the invisible architect of their comfort while they used my name as a synonym for failure. I realized that the only way to gain my freedom was to let their world burn down around them, even if it meant striking the match myself. I was ready to show them the difference between a sister who takes photos and a sister who actually pays the mortgage. The weight of the truth felt like a physical object in my hands as I walked into the venue that evening. I looked at Valerie standing in her shimmering dress, and felt nothing but a cold, clinical pity for the person she had become. At the peak of the celebration, as the speeches were winding down, Gregory stood up to give a final toast that would serve as the catalyst for my liberation. He looked around the room and told them that his pride was just beginning because of the incredible support of his daughter Valerie. He described how Valerie had rescued them from financial ruin and how she was the reason they still had a roof over their heads. I saw Valerie nodding modestly, a fake tear glistening in her eye as she accepted the applause of people who had no idea who she was. Then my father turned his gaze toward me, his voice sharpening into a tone of disappointment as he said it was a shame Jocelyn hadn't learned devotion. He actually chuckled and said, "You'll never be as good as your sister, but maybe one day you'll at least learn to be half as generous." That was the moment the last thread of my patience snapped, with a sound that only I could hear in the crowded room. I stood up slowly, the scraping of my chair against the floor, drawing every eye toward me as I looked my father in the face. I told him with a voice that was eerily calm to tell Valerie to pay every single bill from this moment on because I was done sending another cent. The room went dead silent, the clinking of silverware replaced by a suffocating tension that made Beverly gasp in horror. She stood up and demanded to know what money I was talking about, claiming they had never received a single dollar from me. I didn't argue. I simply reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, connecting it to the large projector screen in the room. I opened the folder Caleb had helped me organize and began to scroll through 4 years of bank statements and tax receipts. I showed them the $15,000 for property taxes and the monthly $600 for their medical premiums. I highlighted the confirmation codes showing clearly that every single one of those payments had originated from my personal salary in Atlanta. I watched as Valerie's face turned gray while she tried to stammer out a lie, but the numbers on the screen were indisputable. My mother looked at the screen and then at Valerie, her voice failing as she realized the Amalfi trip had been funded by the very debt that was now threatening them. I pointed to the $20,000 line of credit Valerie had opened in their names and explained what it would do to their retirement. The guests were whispering now, their eyes darting between the golden child and the daughter who was currently tearing the legacy to shreds. I told Gregory that since he thought I was so inferior, he could enjoy the rest of his retirement with Valerie's charisma instead of my money. I closed my laptop with a definitive click that echoed through the ballroom, feeling the weight of their expectations lift for the first time. I didn't wait for an apology or a justification. I simply walked toward the exit, leaving them to drown in the truth they had worked so hard to ignore. 1 week after the collapse of the party, the digital walls I had built around my life in Atlanta felt like a sanctuary against the storm I unleashed. My phone was a blur of incoming calls and frantic messages from Beverly, who was suddenly aware of my generosity now that the mortgage payment had bounced. Valerie had apparently vanished to a friend's house, leaving our parents to deal with the $20,000 debt she had accrued in their names. I received an email informing me that the upcoming property tax installment was overdue, and for the first time I hit the delete button without feeling guilt. Gregory left a voicemail that started with anger and ended in a sob, begging me to think of the family and help them navigate the mess Valerie made. I listened to it while sitting on my balcony, realizing that he still wasn't apologizing for the disrespect. He was only mourning the loss of his ATM. The reality of the legal system began to close in as the credit card companies started their aggressive collection process. Since Valerie had used Gregory's social security number, he was legally responsible for every cent of the luxury trip she had taken them on. I spoke with Caleb, who confirmed that without my intervention, they would likely have to sell the house within months just to cover the immediate debts. The golden child had turned out to be a financial parasite that had hollowed out their future while they were busy praising her exterior shine. I saw a post from Valerie where she was complaining about toxic family members who weaponize money to control others. It was a classic move trying to paint herself as the victim of my financial abuse, even though she had been the one stealing. I realized then that there was no bottom to her narcissism and no limit to how much my parents would let her get away with. I contacted a lawyer in Austin and instructed him to handle all further communication, making it clear that I would not be providing any more financial assistance. I also had my name legally removed from any remaining joint accounts, effectively cutting the umbilical cord of my resources. The social fallout in their community was devastating. The neighbors who had once listened to Gregory's boasts were now witnessing the "for sale" sign in the front lawn. It was a brutal ending to the facade they had spent decades building, and I felt a sense of justice in seeing the world finally see them clearly. They had traded their reliable daughter for a beautiful lie, and now they were left with nothing but the debt and the shame of their choices. I stopped answering calls from relatives who tried to shame me into being the bigger person and helping my elderly parents. I reminded them that I had been the bigger person for 4 years while being treated like garbage, and now it was someone else's turn. The silence that followed was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard, a clear indication that I was no longer responsible for their self-inflicted wounds. I watched the final destruction of their perfect family dynamic from a distance, knowing that I had finally reclaimed the power they had tried to steal from me since childhood. Today, the sun rises over Atlanta, and I no longer feel the heavy, suffocating pressure of a life that was never truly mine to live. I heard that Gregory and Beverly had to move into a small apartment after the house was sold to cover Valerie's debts and the back taxes. Valerie is currently working as a hostess, finally learning what it feels like to earn a paycheck that isn't subsidized by my silent sacrifices. I haven't spoken to any of them in over 6 months, and the absence of their voices has allowed me to hear the sound of my own worth. I spent years trying to buy a seat at a table where I was never welcome, only to realize that I was the one who owned the restaurant all along. Caleb and I recently celebrated my promotion, and this time we did it in a home that I bought with my own name. I have learned that loyalty without respect is just a fancy word for slavery, and I will never again allow my kindness to be used against me. To those of you who feel like the invisible pillar of your family, please understand that your departure is your ultimate strength. You do not owe your future to people who refuse to acknowledge your present, and you certainly don't owe your success to those who use it to fuel their disrespect. The hardest part of walking away wasn't the loss of the family, but the realization that I had been the one keeping the fire burning while they were using me for warmth. I hope my story gives you the courage to look at your own boundaries and to realize that you are allowed to be the hero of your own life. You deserve to be seen for who you are, not just for what you can provide, and anyone who tells you otherwise is simply trying to keep you in the dark. Thank you so much for listening to my story until the very end. This experience taught me that being family doesn't give someone a license to exploit your labor or silence your value. True peace only comes when you stop seeking approval from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. If you ever find yourself in a situation where your kindness is taken for granted, remember that walking away isn't an act of cruelty, it is an act of self-preservation. You are responsible for your own happiness, not for fixing the lives of those who refuse to respect you. I am truly grateful to everyone who stayed until the final words of this journey. Your time and presence mean the world to me. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below, because I read every single one of them. Your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel helps me continue sharing these honest stories. Let's build a community where we value respect over toxic loyalty. See you